I guess the challenge with education is about scale. And since the Industrial Revolution, where we kind of got into the stage of having mass producing schools and students really, um, we wanted to be delivering the same content and replicating. So essentially, we wanted clones coming out of the school. It was like a factory machine. You go in and you turn into something that can do a certain level of tasks. So you learned a few things, you need to remember a few facts, and you need to be able to do a few skills.
Today we are joined by guest Zubair Junjunia. He is a graduate in mathematics from University College London. He's the founder of ZNotes, an online revision tool, and holds ambassadorial roles with organizations such as One Young World and IMPACTR. He's also passionate about spreading awareness around the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which focuses on quality education. This podcast is created with the intent to spread awareness around education and the problems faced by its various stakeholders, and eventually to create a learning resource for all of these stakeholders. We're so glad to have you on this podcast, Zubair, and without any further ado, we'll dive straight into the questions. So, my first question requires a little bit of context. So, we have had people on this podcast who started out as concerned parents, misinformation debunkers, corporate sector businessmen, really people from all walks of life, who then went on to carve out a niche in education. You, meanwhile, started off as a student founding ZNotes at 16. So I have two questions here. First of all, what incentivized you to start the platform in the first place?
So when I was 16, I was in Saudi Arabia in Jeddah studying in an international school, and we were gonna, we all knew we were gonna head off to do IGCSEs and the international A levels to be then able to attend international universities. And while I went into those exams, I just came to realize, and I'm sure I was quite old for this realization. I should have known about this at a younger age, but that there were schools and students all around me who would be going into the same exam. They would be doing the same IGCSE. The one I was doing was a Cambridge one, and yet the quality of resources, the support, the teaching, they would vary so drastically. And I knew schools neighboring us who were unable to get the most updated textbooks just because they weren't unable to afford it, and this huge disparity in the type of support and resources that students could get, the input for their education, and the requirement of sitting the same exam and being assessed across each other. We're going to be compared at the end of the day. This disparity just didn't sit well with me, and so I've decided to set up ZNotes as a way, as a small way for me to start leveling this playing field.
And how did your ongoing experience as a student factor into the way that ZNotes was created?
A big part of it, basically. Obviously, as a student, I was always thinking about it from a student's perspective. So whether it was a language, the structure, the style, everything was done in that perspective of what makes sense for me as the learner. And because it was built for the learner, it immediately had a relatability with with the students who were going to go on to study this. And as we continue to grow and develop, I head off to university, and even then, the kind of the mantra we stuck with and we focused on, and our slogan really is for students by students, and this is embedded within what the Xenos organization does, from the way we design and develop new features to the way the content is produced to the way that our day-to-day tasks are carried out. At every stage there are students leading that process. So we have it's a challenge, making sure that we get the best quality content, we moderate it, we make sure there are no errors, they are of the highest quality. But we've made sure that even at every stage of the process we have students to write the content, to review the content, to produce the videos, to edit the videos, to make sure that stuff is being delivered at its highest quality. And I think this experience of doing it while I was a student made sure that this is the design of the organization moving forward. And I think it's created something very unique. Um, there's a relatability factor which is not seen very often in edtech. And specifically, it makes students feel like they belong to this, because it isn't something that their teachers are forcing them to go to. It's something that students have developed, and they're going to it because they feel like that is a space that they connect to at an intrinsic level. And so we're really pleased, and I think I'm really glad I set it up at that age because it's made sure that the way we move forward is always keeping that learner in the front seat of what we do.
Yeah, so I recently gave my A levels earlier this year, and I can't tell you how excited I was for this podcast because it was a resource that I used, and I think it really resonated with me as a student because ZNotes was never something that our teachers told us to go to. It was
Mm,
always something that the students were like, that you could use this resource. This is what our seniors told us to use, sort of thing, and it sort of built that community over time,
absolutely.
right? And eventually, I think ZNotes also branched out to other boards beyond just the IGCSE and the A level and
Mm.
came to include like the SAT and IB and all those things. So, when you were creating a platform focused on academic notes, you must have had an overview of the way different educational boards function or what their priorities are. And with that context, what do you think the curriculum of conventional education focuses on? And should they be focusing on something else instead?
Yeah, so one thing, I guess the challenge with education is about scale. And since the Industrial Revolution, where we kind of got into the stage of, having mass producing schools and students really, we wanted to be delivering the same content and replicating. So essentially we wanted clones coming out of the school. It was like a factory machine. You go in and you turn into something that can do a certain level of tasks. So you learned a few things, you need to remember a few facts, and you need to be able to do a few skills. Um, and as we've kind of developed since then, I think the challenge of scalability is always part of education. How do you deliver something which is then applicable to a group of 20, 30, 50, 100, thousands and thousands of students? How do you start making sure that they are all achieving and reaching some of the targets that they believe it set out? So many curriculums and across the different sub syllabuses that we've looked at, there tends to be a huge deal of similarity. So although there will be slight nuances, slight differences in terms of how deep a certain syllabus decides to go in a certain topic, um, but overall, we all need to learn the basic things about biology and chemistry and physics, and each syllabus wants you to do that. The big difference is how they're being assessed. Um, most of the kind of exam boards have these kind of final exams to assess you. Um, the only thing is the format. So sometimes you'll have multiple papers, and then you need to be thinking about, okay, I'm going to start to focus and revise only this section for this paper. Um, I think that the fact that we are, because the next question was, should we focus on something else? The fact that we are still in this state of creating or delivering content or building syllabuses so that we can get students to go through a certain exam and be able to regurgitate a certain set of information and pass it, is just flawed at its core. And if we're going to continuously be updating and creating new things, but still have that as the final assessment tool, then it's not really about what the syllabus contains. Because I think at the end of the day, you do need those basic principles of science, mathematics, and English. Um, but if we're assessing it in the same way, we won't ever get to a stage where we're developing skills such as collaboration, creative thinking, problem solving. Some subjects have that, but most of them don't. And I think the my kind of the flipping this back to you is that instead of looking at what the curriculum contains, which is okay, I think that the method of assessment is what's flawed in our education system.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, it's a paper and pen exam that focuses more on how well you can remember things rather than how well you understand things, and
And
or
and
how well you can convey that information on paper.
Yeah, and often you find that some students who are really very intelligent and do understand concepts very deeply are unable to perform well in exams just because there's a certain knack for doing an exam well, and that it's a bit sad because these students who or these people who are really understand stuff are unable to get through a system which is and it restricts them from further growth. So it's a little bit weird. I should just kind of like put a caveat because I am not saying that people shouldn't know stuff. We then have a quite a negative outlook on to memory. We say that, oh, you guys are just memorizing these notes to go and do the exams. Um, I think the fact that if you're just trying to memorize without understanding the content and try to just go in and, as I said, regurgitate the information, that is that I don't agree with. But if you are actually the kind of the skill of memorization is something crucial. You're not going to go to a doctor and expect him to, you know what, let me Google this or let me pick up a textbook and find the exact ailment that you're facing, because you want the people to know. And one aspect of being learned in a certain field or domain is knowing the terms, knowing the kind of glossary of that subject, because it starts to help you develop the next concepts. If you don't, not only if you don't understand the basic concepts, but if those basic concepts are not instilled in your mind as very very like kind of memorized things, as things that are just like present always in your mind, then you won't be able to get to that next step and understand the more complex concepts, which take those basic principles and put them together. So this is something that I had to and I think maybe in the later question you might touch on to this, but in math especially, we spent a lot of time in my first few years of uni trying to just get the definitions right, the first principle theorems, and only when I got through that stage was I able to start taking those varying pieces of information, those definitions, and putting it together into something that was more complex. But if I hadn't gone through that initial stage, I would never be able to put it together essentially. So I guess the summary of this is that there is this challenge with assessment, but let that not be kind of a reason for us to not be trying to understand and remember concepts, because it is still crucial to have certain important facts information at the tip of your tongue.
Yeah, that's true. But I think there's a difference in skill. Like there is a particular skill to being a good exam giver,
Hmm.
and then there's another particular skill to being a good learner. And there's a certain amount of overlap. I'm not going to omit that there's a certain amount of overlap between the things you need to remember as an exam giver and the things you would remember to be a good learner. But
Correct.
unfortunately, that overlap is sort of shrinking. And we want to look at ways where being a good learner and our assessments can sort of have a larger overlap. Just 2 cents.
Absolutely.
But you did say something about how these memorization of certain terms and terminologies helped you in like your graduation. So, as a recent master's graduate, do you think that the academic and social goals in high school successfully prepare students to succeed in college in a college setting?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a tough one because in a lot of ways, so I studied mathematics, and pretty much everything I studied at school was irrelevant to my university degree. None of it actually went forward because as soon as you get into math, you realize that you've only been studying this tiny pinnacle uh, at school, and you kind of go in and you're like, "Oh, this is vast and abstract," and you never think about things like analysis and algebra at school. Um, so there was a big difference, big jump for me in terms of the content. So in many ways, in that sense, school did not prepare me for that content itself. But at the same time, I grew a lot during my school life, and I grew socially, I grew emotionally, I grew mentally in being capable of doing different things. And some of it was because of the support that the school gave me, but some of it was just because of the community I was surrounded by and my friends and my kind of peer group. So I guess the answer to this is that school can prepare you for university, but it's also about what you decide to take out of school. I at early years, I was still quite shy and not confident enough to get involved with all the activities. But by the end of my kind of school years, when I was in my final sixth form, by that time I was really taking things and grabbing at them, taking opportunities, getting my school to do different things for me. So I decided, because I was going to go do math, there was no further math subject offered at school, but I decided that I had to do this. So I told my school that I was going to do it and I was going to self-study it, and I wanted the school to support me in some form. They didn't support me academically, but they did make sure that I was, that I could do the exam there. They allowed me to do my A level maths independently. They allowed us to form a small group. So me and three other friends decided that we're going to do this together. So we literally cut off from the rest of the school. We went to our own classrooms and we would teach ourselves. So that kind of independent learning, that kind of taking an initiative and a kind of a decision to that was quite a difficult one. You know, you don't have the support of a teacher anymore. You're just saying that, hey, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm taking the responsibility for it. These were things which, in many ways, supported me a lot. And these kind of experiences were crucial to my development and my growth at university because being independent and responsible is something that you're gonna have to do in your first few years of uni anyway. So it's a bit of a it's I would say it's like a there's no yes or no to that. There's a little bit of both. There is some support that you get from school, and the more you kind of grasp at it, the opportunities that you take up, you can take more of it to university. But at the same time, the uni kind of space is just such a vast and um, such a new area that you're going to be entering that you're going to have to try and stuff out and mess up and continue going from there.
Yeah, I will be going to college soon, so let's hope that something from here translates. Uh, but um, yeah, that sort of stands true for anything that once you take, it's often an independent experience of how much you take
Yeah.
away from a particular activity or a particular setting.
Hmm.
But at the same time, I think educational institutes are crafted in a way, or at least the intention at the very beginning was that they're crafted in a way to sort of prepare students to move out into the world. And that's the point of education. How do you create intellectuals or just good people at its core? I hope. So, but unfortunately, in a lot of schools, that's not the case. And it often comes down to the way we have now begun perceiving education as a society. So I just want to throw this one out there. What are some flaws that exist currently in the way we think of education on like a broader level?
Quite a deep question, actually. And I guess my answer is that for many, many years, we've been looking at education as a very standard pathway into career, job, and life, essentially. You know, we go through school, you do a certain number of A levels, you get the degree, you get a qualification, a professional qualification, maybe. You head into your first kind of corporate job, and you just work up the rungs of the ladder and get to some point and feel happy, and that's your life. Um, I think the world has very quickly shown us that this is not true, especially the last few years of how startups and how the tech industry and many industries are actually, challenging this need for a university degree. They're challenging the things that are coming out of school. Um, so we are at this kind of like a very pivotal stage. But at the same time, society still believes in education being something which is deeply linked to something with jobs, and that's something which I personally don't really like. It we I had some levels of challenges, and with my own family when I was trying to communicate that I wanted to study math, because there was no kind of they couldn't see, and even my teachers couldn't see why I was going out to do that. And it wasn't just that subject, but many kind of deep or pure scientific or pure social science subjects tend to be looked at as, why are you going out to do this? Where does this take you to your job? And that is really sad, because if you are at the age of 17, 16, thinking about what your A-level subjects are going to translate into a degree, into a job, then you've missed a plot. You missed a trick, because you're not pursuing something because you're passionate and interested about it, and more about the potential career opportunities it provides. And the sad part is that, or the reality is that many of those career opportunities are not linked to being an engineer or a doctor. There are some professional qualifications that you need, or some qualification which leads directly to a career, and that's absolutely fine. You need doctors to do what they do, but most of the degrees that we are available at university don't necessarily have to translate to a specific job. And realizing this, or this kind of this misconception in society is one that I wish was changed, because it kills the curiosity, the academic curiosity, that honest search for truth at a young age, because we then are immediately thinking about how we're going to be living financially rather than thinking about those first few years of university of just exploring something that we're really, really curious about. And I'm so glad I took my decision. There was no kind of there's no job at the end of what I was planning to do. Even now, I'm kind of now running Xenos and doing a whole bunch of different things, and never part of my plan. But I got to spend 4 years of university doing something I really, really loved and taking away skills which are applicable in all cases. So this misconception of education and degrees linked to a job and a pathway is one that is just not true anymore, and one which is killing a lot of curiosity. And I wish that would was something that people kind of like understood and try to make a difference for.
Yeah, and that's still prevalent. This is not just an issue with families from like lower income classes, but across the board, it's more about
Yeah,
how does your uh, school education translate eventually into a career? How do you start making money?
yeah, yeah,
And which is important, crucial, but at the same time, there are other things worth learning for, other objectives worth learning for. But like I said, in the lower end of the socioeconomic classes, oftentimes jobs and money tend to far surpass other endeavors, other reasons to learn. And which is why I'm coming back to your passion for the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 4
mhm.
on quality education across the board. So, what are some prevalent and pressing problems in the education space that need to be solved in order to move towards the goals of the Sustainable Development Goal?
Yeah. So I think the big issue with education is that because it's something that is such a basic has and we're in a golden age of whatever of education as it were, because we suddenly education is a priority in every individual, in every family, right? We're thinking about how best we can kind of get our children to be educated. So it's amazing, it's absolutely great, and we have such a high priority for it. But at the same time, it is also allowing certain corporations, certain businesses to spring up and kind of exploit these families who are trying to get the best for their children, or children who are looking for the best type of education. And in many ways, the access to quality education is just possible. It is available, and in many ways, with certain kind of tweaks and with certain kind of input into kind of financial or logistic, we can really make high quality education accessible to all. We have the wealth of the internet. If it was curated and kind of displayed to someone carefully, we have incredible teaching talent which are dispersed across the world, and yet we live in this stage of paying a lot of money to get quality education, and there's a great variation in what you can receive with what you pay. And this kind of this the tying in of a financial element to education is I think the biggest barrier to reaching equitable, high quality education for all. We have lots of businesses, just companies that exist on that foundation, that by keeping this barrier, this margin as far as possible, we can be surviving as a business. So because of this mindset, because of this structure that exists in the corporate world, we are unable to achieve it. And as long as we have this great variation in the type of education and quality of education between the classes, between the different socioeconomic levels, between the geographic locations, we won't get to the stage of having it available for all.
And one thing that sort of really made this gap between quality education even wider between the socioeconomic classes is
Mhm.
the pandemic, because suddenly internet access and tech has never been as important as it has been in this day and age, especially when it comes to education. And the and it has definitely had a sort of lasting effect on the way we do a number of things. But how do you think that it will mold the way education moves forward?
Great question, and it already has, I think. Um, so education as an institution, I guess, is a lethargic, large organization or large kind of school of thought, and it has a lot of inertia. It takes a lot of input to make it do anything. And technology has always been kind of like a battling with it, right? So for many, many years, I don't know for how your school has been doing stuff, but I remember back in the day when I was at school. Back in the day, I sound old now. But as things started to infiltrate our school, like we got smart boards and we got these, like, oh my gosh, our teachers can actually project stuff onto the screen and we can see it without rolling in a TV or a projector. All these different slowly, like it was such a slow process for anything new to come in. I still remember going to the reception carrying a registration book, because every morning my teacher would take a register and she would send two kids together to put it at reception. And by the end of school, by the time I was leaving, we had a kind of an automatic system which was all on the internet. Every teacher had kind of online profiles. Each student had their own thing. So we slowly shifted from this kind of we only do computing stuff in the IT lab, and now it's part of our day to day lives. And more now, my work at the Bedford School here in the UK is showing me like there's even more technology than ever before. And the pandemic specifically, sorry, I'm kind of adding some context to this, but the pandemic has essentially thrusted us to accept and implement technological solutions into our education system. It was impossible to do it without it, right? We cannot be delivering um, lots of those lessons to our students if we hadn't used the technological tools that we did. So we were forced to do so. We were forced to accept technology into the folds, and start using it as a way to deliver educational content, assess, make sure boys and girls are on top of their things. We used it for pastoral care. We use it for everything now. Um, and as we're still at a kind of a weird time, right? We're in a limbo stage of whether it's going to be over or not. We're still unsure, but whatever is going to happen next, we've already proven and displayed that technology can, is, and has to be used in education. So I think having that, having seen the change that has happened during this time, during lockdown, um, we cannot turn back. But the question that remains, and the thing that we need to be really kind of, I think, critical about is how do we take it forward? So there were some things that technology with education did really, really well. It made stuff for accessibility amazing for students who were had certain learning disabilities. They suddenly had the ability to turn on captions on video lessons. They had the ability to rewatch lessons. They had more time. They had students who felt anxious, who were not feeling comfortable coming into school, felt much safer in their homes. Students who had other activities that they wanted to get involved with now had much more time instead of traveling hour and a half on a bus or anything like that. So we started to see some incredible benefits, but at the same time, we cannot forget that human beings are social animals. We like to be around other human beings, and we lost the sense of community, the sense of belonging when we were in our kind of tiny rooms. I definitely faced that a lot. I felt really kind of unwell, as it were, by just being online the whole time, whether it was for work, whether it was for education, and having a need. There's a necessity for us to be around, because there's a magic that happens when people come together, right? We can do as many agendaed, scheduled things as possible, and we can do much more content delivery by going with 45-minute lessons. But we miss out on the the quips in a classroom. We miss out on the creative projects that come up because boys are sitting next to each other. We miss out on so many critical and crucial things just because we're not in the same place at the same time. So I guess my answer is that we have seen the power and the impact that technology can have in education, but we've also seen the drawbacks. We've seen what hasn't worked. So moving forward, we need to be very critical about how we take technology into the next steps. How do we use it as a way to level the playing field, to get it more accessible to students, to have more support for those who need it. But at the same time, let's not forget that there's intrinsically a human element to it all, and we need to be together. And what is the best way to maximize that time that we have together in a classroom or in a social space?
Sort of encompassed my next question also, which was going to be on the role of edtech, because that's something that we've been
Of course.
touching upon quite a few times over the course of the podcast. If you have any further thoughts on how EdTech can factor into this new age technological revolution.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a, I think again, with every all my answers, I've had a little bit of a negative and a positive, and I'll continue it to the rest to the end of it. Um, so as I said, we've seen edtech tools being implemented. Never before has there more. I think recently I was reading some news, and edtech has seen a surge in investment. There's just a huge number of startups coming up, and it's so cool to see these little like these groups of people coming up with new ideas for very niche and specific problems in education. And these are things which we haven't thought about. At ZNotes, we're thinking about a very broad audience, but they're targeting specific challenges. They're looking at different ways to teach very specific skills and tools, and that is incredible. The kind of the way we're creatively coming up with new ideas to teach, educate, and support learners is just amazing. But at the same time, as I said, edtech is also it's also being exploitive. There are some companies which are using it as, especially pandemic, as a time to maximize revenue. They're saying, okay, everyone's online, just let's get online schooling in, let's get tutors just churning out content, and let's make as much money as possible. So we have to be very critical about what type of tools we take into our schools. Um, there are a lot of things to be thinking about regarding ethics, and it is technology and ethics has always been a weird place because technology evolves so quickly, and especially things like AI and ML. These are things which are so unknown to us that there is no central governance or body which can actually see data protection and the right procedures with which data is input into a platform or AI system, and the biases which are starting to generate. We're starting to use automatic marking tools for lots of things, essay marking tools. How do we make sure that there isn't a bias inbuilt into the systems? So there's a lot still in edtech that needs to be considered, understood, that it needs to be explored further, and it needs to be very critically thought about as we move forward. um, but overall, the fact that we're coming up with creative ways to solve the biggest challenges in education, and each kind of small company, each startup, each initiative or organization is doing something in a slightly different way and coming up with better ways to do stuff, is just incredible. And it's really exciting what we can start doing when we merge together. We bring the power of a school, the kind of the incredibly um, human element of pastoral care that teachers deliver, and we build that and we bring it together with technology and the speed and the efficiency and the kind of just the scalability of certain tasks that it can help us achieve. So when that bridge, when we do form that bridge, and it's starting to form, and we truly kind of intersperse those two things together, we're going to be in a very exciting time.
Yeah, there's a lot to look forward to. And like you said, there are a lot of different things we still have to consider.
Mhm.
Those are all the questions I had for you today. If you have any closing thoughts.
No, not at all. I think the questions were great. I got a chance to like tell you a lot about my personal thoughts and the dynamics and how education is going to be changing. I guess my final remarks are just that a lot of what I've been able to achieve over the last few years, and as a student, as the positions I'm at right now, have been by taking initiative and by by trying something out. And if there are people listening, whether they are far up on one side of the spectrum where they're teachers and educators, or they're in careers and working on stuff, for them it's also about, you might feel comfortable in the situation, things that you're doing, but put yourself in an uncomfortable situation, try something new out, think about ways with which your students could be benefiting. um, be be confident and explorative and experiment. And for the other spectrum, if there are students listening, then I would say that this goes for you to be explorative, experiment, and try new things out. You're at an age where you can really do a lot of stuff, and there's not a lot of repercussions for you. You're not bound by a lot of like things as soon as you start growing up with financial restrictions and these things like that. You have a supportive family. You are able to do certain things. So leverage that time to do something cool, to try something out. So just give it a shot.
Thank you so much for taking the time out to be on this podcast. It was a lovely conversation. And yeah, that's all I had for you today. Thank you.